The Bible. It's a collection of ancient texts, prophecies, poetry, history, and letters. It holds stories of kings, shepherds, wars, and miracles. But for many, the Bible remains an unopened mystery. Here at The Bible Explained, we're not just reading verses, we're exploring the cultural bedrock and the dramatic narrative woven through its 66 books. Hit that subscribe button and let the journey begin.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are wrestling with what might be the single toughest, most challenging narrative in the entire Abrahamic tradition.
Genesis chapter 22.
The Akedah, the binding of Isaac.
It really is the ultimate paradox, isn't it?
It is. I mean, think about it. The story lands right after God has made this solemn, completely non-negotiable promise to Abraham.
That his entire future, his legacy, this great nation, it will all be established through Isaac.
And then, almost in the next breath, God commands Abraham to take that very son, that promised heir, and offer him as a burnt offering.
It's a complete self-contradiction. The command literally cancels out the promise. It's an act that would just wipe out the entire future God had just pledged to create.
That is the theological earthquake at the center of this.
Exactly. And, the narrative poses this profound secondary problem, one that's challenged readers for millennia, and that's Abraham's silence. His total silence.
Right. We all remember Abraham arguing, and I mean really arguing, with God back in Genesis 18 over Sodom.
He was so passionate. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? He advocates for total strangers.
But when God commands him to kill his own son, nothing. Not a single word of protest. He just gets up and goes.
So for this deep dive, that's what we're charting. We're going to explore the really diverse ways that Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, and modern scholarship too, have tried to resolve this.
Or in some cases, refused to resolve it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what that reveals is, well, it's pretty surprising stuff about the nature of faith, the character of God, and even the very concept of parental rights.
Okay, so let's start by setting the stage a bit, both emotionally and historically, because even the way the command is structured, it feels designed to maximize the stakes.
Oh, it's an exercise in rhetorical cruelty. It really is. God doesn't just say, sacrifice Isaac. The language escalates.
It twists the knife.
It does. With every single phrase, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. The text forces you, the reader, to feel the full, agonizing weight of that loss right alongside Abraham.
And while for us, I mean, for any modern reader, the command is instantly horrifying, unthinkable.
Criminal.
Right. But we have to try to place ourselves in the ancient Near East.
That context is just crucial. In Abraham's world, child sacrifice, especially of a firstborn, was, well, it was a dark but sadly common practice in some cultures, a kind of ultimate desperate act to appease a demanding God.
So the idea itself wouldn't have been completely out of left field for him.
Not completely. The crisis for Abraham was not that God asked for a child sacrifice, but that he asked for this specific child, the miracle son of his old age, the one who held the entire covenant in his person.
And the narrative just moves with this terrifying speed. Abraham's reply is so immediate, so faithful.
And Anani.
Yeah.
Just, here I am. It establishes this instant disposition of absolute, unquestioning obedience.
And that phrase, here I am, it's not an accident that it appears again, is it?
Not at all. It's a deliberate narrative device. The text uses that exact same phrase to link his readiness to obey God directly to his readiness as a father when Isaac asks that awful, pivotal question.
The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?
And it's that quiet readiness, that obedience that Jewish scholars for centuries really had to grapple with. How do you keep a loving, promise-keeping God in a story with a command like that?
Which brings us to the really fascinating ways the Jewish traditions tried to solve this. And often it wasn't about changing the outcome, but changing how we understand the command itself.
Right. Take the classical Midrash in Genesis Rabbah, which the great commentator Rashi quotes. It attacks the problem through a kind of linguistic subtlety.
They zeroed in on the exact Hebrew.
Exactly. The instruction God gave was Halehu Sham Lala, literally bring him up there as a burnt offering.
And the interpretation hinges on that wording.
Entirely. The Midrash suggests God only meant bring him up, as in up the mountain or onto the altar, but crucially not slay him.
So it was a staging.
It's a staging. The Midrash almost imagines Abraham as this clever rabbinic lawyer pointing out the contradiction to God. You promised him life, you commanded his death, and God basically says, my words never contradict. You were only supposed to bring him up. You fulfilled the command, now you can bring him down.
But wait a minute. If the test was just about a psychologically terrifying 3-day hike, doesn't that kind of undermine the seriousness of the whole event? It feels like it lets Abraham off the hook.
That's precisely why not all Jewish scholars were happy with that solution. Take Abraham ibn Ezra, a major medieval figure who championed Peshat, the plain, literal reading of the text. He hated the linguistic gymnastics of the Midrash.
So what was his take? He must have seen the contradiction.
Oh, he saw it. For him, Olah means burnt offering, full stop. His solution, he argues that God's word, well, it sometimes changes.
God changes his mind?
Yes. He points to other places in the Bible where God modifies an earlier instruction, like when the priestly role of the firstborn sons gets replaced by the Levites.
I think for a lot of us, the idea that God just changed his mind is almost as challenging as the initial command. How does Ibn Ezra square that with an immutable God?
He doesn't really try to square it. He just says the divine will is sovereign, it's dynamic. For him, the test wasn't about theological consistency. The whole point was for Abraham to get a huge public reward for his willingness to give up everything. God only changed the command after Abraham proved his love.
Okay, so then there's the third way from Rashbam, who suggests Abraham actually made a mistake, that the test was linked to something else entirely.
Yeah, this one is really interesting. Rashbam suggests God was actually angry that Abraham had made a covenant, a treaty, with Avimelech, the Philistine king.
How does that connect?
Well, the command to sacrifice Isaac was God's way of showing Abraham how useless that treaty was. Like, what good is your political alliance if the very heir to the promise is gone? In this view, Abraham was misreading a divine sign. He got the command wrong.
So we have three really different Jewish explanations. 1, the command was misunderstood. 2, God genuinely changed his mind. And 3, Abraham misinterpreted the whole thing.
And then you have the fourth, which is maybe the most straightforward, from Radak. He sees it as the ultimate model of unquestioning faith. Why didn't Abraham argue? For Radak, that's the whole point.
The silence is the virtue.
The silence is the virtue. The test was designed to show all future generations the depth of Abraham's total love for God. His obedience was meant to be the perfect, unchallengeable example for all believers, Jews and Christians alike.
And that idea of Abraham as the perfect model of faith is the perfect bridge to how Christian tradition solved the Akedah paradox. They didn't use linguistic nuance so much as a completely different theological lens.
Yeah, the lens of the New Testament. The key, written around 100 CE, is found in the Epistle to the Hebrews. It basically provides the resolution by reading Abraham's mind.
What does it say he was thinking?
It says Abraham reconciled the contradiction, the command to kill versus the promise of lineage, because he had faith that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead.
So Christian interpretation essentially solves the Old Testament problem by applying a New Testament concept, faith in the resurrection.
Exactly. And once you do that, Isaac is transformed into the ultimate prefigurement of Christ, a type.
And the parallels they draw they're pretty powerful.
They're very specific and very deliberate. Both Isaac and Jesus are called the only beloved sons of a righteous father. Genesis makes a point of saying Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice up the hill.
Just as Christ carried the cross up Golgotha.
And that 3-day journey to Moriah is seen as a mirror, a foreshadowing of the 3 days between Christ's crucifixion and resurrection.
So Abraham's famous line to Isaac, God himself will provide the lamb, takes on a whole new meaning. It's not just about the ram in the thicket.
Not at all. The ram caught in the thicket is just the immediate fulfillment. It's read as foreshadowing the ultimate provision, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The ram substitutes for Isaac, which points directly to the Son of God, substituting himself for humanity.
It seems like the sheer impossibility of the command is actually what gives the story its theological power. I know Martin Luther really focused on that.
Luther saw that contradiction as the absolute core of the trial. He said, if Isaac must be killed, the promise is void. Human reason has to conclude God is a liar, either in the command or in the promise.
So how does Abraham get out of that bind?
According to Luther, this devastating conflict forced Abraham to essentially invent the concept of resurrection on his own, just to keep faith in both of God's decrees.
Wait, so Luther is suggesting that Abraham, he had to invent the idea of resurrection just to make sense of God's promises. That's a huge theological leap.
It's seismic. It makes Abraham not just an obedient servant, but a proactive theologian who is defining the very nature of divine power.
Wow. It makes him the ultimate interpreter, proving that God's power extends beyond the grave.
Precisely.
Okay, let's pivot now to the Islamic tradition. They view the event as the Dabihah, the sacrifice, But there's a fundamental difference that really changes the entire landscape of the story.
The key difference, of course, is the identity of the son. While the Quran doesn't explicitly name him, the overwhelming, dominant view in Islamic tradition is that the son was Ishmael, or Ismail, Abraham's firstborn.
And why that crucial shift from Isaac to Ishmael? What's the thinking there?
Well, it rests on a couple of foundational arguments. First, sacrificing the firstborn son, the one who came after a lifetime of waiting, is seen as an even more rigorous, more difficult test of devotion.
A bigger sacrifice.
A bigger sacrifice. And second, and maybe more importantly, is geography. The foundational rituals of the Hajj pilgrimage in Islam were all historically and geographically linked to Ishmael and his mother Hagar in Mecca.
The running between Safa and Marwa, the Kaaba.
All of it. So localizing the sacrifice in Mecca with Ishmael ties the Dabihah directly to the birthplace and center of the Islamic covenant.
And the narrative style in the Quran is different too, isn't it? The emphasis is really on submission.
Absolutely. In the Quran, in Surah 37, when Prophet Ibrahim tells his son about the vision, the son's response is immediate. It's profoundly cooperative. He says, "Oh, my father, do as you are commanded."
So it's a shared act of faith.
It's a shared act. That dialogue emphasizes the core concept of Islam, total, immediate submission to God's will, a concept embodied by both the father and the son.
And this act of obedience is, of course, commemorated by Muslims worldwide today.
Yes, globally, during Eid al-Adha, the Feast of Sacrifice. The ritual sacrifice of livestock symbolizes Ibrahim's willingness to obey, and it reinforces Mecca as the ultimate site of that ancient, pure, monotheistic obedience.
So let's shift gears a little, because modern scholarship and ethics have really pushed back on this idea that the story is simply about blind obedience. We have to go back to that problem of Abraham's silence.
The contrast is just so undeniable, and it's disturbing. Why argue for wicked strangers in Sodom, but not for your own innocent, beloved son?
Right, and this leads to a really influential argument.
Yeah.
That maybe the test wasn't about blind obedience at all. Maybe it was about Abraham's discernment.
His discernment of God's true character. I mean, he came from a pagan Mesopotamian culture where gods demanded blood. Perhaps the ultimate test was to see if Abraham finally understood that his God, the God of the covenant, was a God of mercy, one who fundamentally rejects human sacrifice.
So the test wasn't, will you kill your son?
It was, will you argue with me not to, and in doing so, prove that you truly understand my character?
This is where the philosophers really get involved. I'm thinking of Søren Kierkegaard and his teleological suspension of the ethical.
Right, the idea that sometimes for a higher divine purpose, the telos, the universal ethical rule like thou shalt not kill, has to be suspended.
It's a terrifying concept, really.
It is, but for Kierkegaard it's necessary. The individual's act of faith must sometimes overrule the universal ethical duty to fulfill a direct divine command.
And that idea is fiercely rejected by many contemporary thinkers, and for good reason. I know Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks argued against it.
He did, passionately. He said it's a dangerous intellectual move. It basically gives religious fanatics a blank check to commit atrocities and just claim God told me to do it.
So what's his alternative? It's not about murder, and it's not about blind obedience. What was God really asking for?
Sacks proposes something completely revolutionary. He says it was about renouncing ownership.
Ownership.
Ownership of the child. Sacks argues the test was designed to establish one foundational principle. Children are not the property of their parents. It was a direct attack on the ancient pagan concept of patria potestas, the father's absolute legal right over his child, including the right to kill them.
Wow. So God didn't want a sacrifice of life.
He wanted a sacrifice of ownership. He wanted Abraham to renounce that ancient, toxic idea. The moment Abraham proves he's willing to relinquish his claim, God stops him. The angel even says, "You have not withheld from me your son, your only one." The child belongs to God. The parent is just a guardian.
That completely reframes the entire story. It turns it from a demand for death into a new charter for ethical parenting.
It does. And it reminds me of that wonderful midrash from Rabbi Leuvinger, who suggested the ram wasn't a sudden miracle.
Right, that it was created on the last day of creation and was already there caught in the thicket the whole time.
Exactly. The real revelation, in that view, wasn't God magically providing a substitute. It was the substitute having been there all along. The test was for Abraham to lift up his eyes, to change his perception, look beyond the tragedy he was focused on, and see the provision God had already placed right beside him.
Finally, we can't ignore that this story is also rooted in a very specific place, the land of Moriah, and that geography is still a battleground.
The geography is everything. The land of Moriah from Genesis 22 is explicitly identified later in 2 Chronicles as Mount Moriah.
The exact site where Solomon builds the first temple in Jerusalem.
Exactly. And that identification is critical. It turns the location of the greatest test of faith into the single holiest site in Judaism.
But those claims are deeply contested, right? Which just shows how important controlling the geography of a story is.
Absolutely. The Samaritans claim the binding happened on their holy site, Mount Gerizim. Christians connect the Moriah region to Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. And as we said, Islamic tradition links the event firmly to Mecca.
What's fascinating is that scholars point out the identification of Moriah with the Temple Mount probably wasn't original to the Genesis story.
No, almost certainly not. That identification was solidified much later, and it was a fundamentally ideological move, a deliberate construction to centralize Jewish worship and to assert religious and territorial authority against all the competing claims. The fight over where Abraham stood is really a fight over who owns the covenant.
So we've walked through centuries of interpretation. Whether we see Abraham's act as literal obedience, as faith in resurrection, as total submission, or as this profound act of ethical discernment, the story's weight just endures.
It endures because no matter how you read it, the story functions as this incredibly powerful polemic against human sacrifice. By stopping the act and providing the substitute, God establishes that he is a God of life, a God of provision, not some deity demanding human blood.
Okay, so here's something for you to mull over. If God gave Abraham a 3-day journey to think, and he'd already given him the ethical precedent of protesting injustice in Sodom, Abraham argued God into a corner there. Was the ultimate unstated lesson of the Akedah really about blind obedience at all?
So the test was something else.
Was the true test whether Abraham had finally learned, when he was permitted, or maybe even required, to question a command that seemed to violate God's own established character of mercy and justice? Something to carry with you long after this deep dive is over.
Indeed.
Until next time.
The Bible isn't just a history book. It's a living, challenging text. As you reflect on what we covered today regarding this topic, consider how this new context changes your reading of the verses. If you appreciated this breakdown, sharing it with just one friend who struggles with understanding the Bible is the best way you can support the channel. Subscribe for more, click here for your next explanation, and never stop seeking clarity. Until next time.